Right. Good evening or good afternoon, depends on whether we are in the evening or not. Good evening. I'm Professor Hua Zhao. I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor Research. I was asking William how many people would understand the meaning of Pro Vice Chancellor, and he said probably 5%. Yeah, basically, I'm the vice president of equivalent to look after the research across the university. So I am very delighted today to welcome you here for this very special evening, the inaugural lecture of Professors Jago Morrison and William Watkin. And this evening is extra special evening as it is the first inaugural lecture of our new series for this academic year, and also is one of the few where I have two eminent professors talking at the same time. Uh, Firstly, a very important housekeeping note. We are not expecting a fire alarm. So should the fire alarm sound, please leave the building and assemble on the adjacent grass area. Our stewards will obviously guide you. Thank you. Uh, So being appointed as a professor is a special achievement, being an academic, recognizing those who truly excel in their field. I therefore would like to congratulate Jago and William on this well-deserved achievement, although it's probably very long time ago when William got his chair. Right, right, okay. Yes. Uh, so Jago Morrison is a professor of English and specializes in contemporary literature. And his key areas of expertise are contemporary fiction and security, and also post-colonial writing in English, with a special interest in Chinua Achebe. So Jago's current research explores the role of writers in intelligence. That's why we have spies here, I guess. Uh, What else? Oh, recent and forthcoming pieces explore themes of radicalization, terrorism, and the changing security paradigm since September 9/11. So William Walking is a professor of contemporary philosophy and literature. He has been at Brunel since 1999. It's a few years later than me. uh, and has held a personal chair there since 2008. And he's currently the director of research for the Arts and Humanity Department. So Williams' research profile in the field of philosophy and theory is extremely well established, highly regarded, influential, and wide-ranging. So in recent years, he has become interested in applying theoretical ideas to contemporary world problems. So the work he's going to present today actually began in his 2021 book. I can see here, Bioviolence: How the Powers uh, that Made Us Do What They Want, and will form part of his forthcoming COVID, Biopolitics, and Suspension of the Nomos. Okay, excellent. So these books are the first two parts of an ongoing series of studies of contemporary life and changing nature of power. So they are therefore I'm so pleased to be part of this new series of inaugural lectures celebrating the careers of some of Brunel's most talented and creative individuals. And we need to go to the next slide. Okay, so I do hope that you will be able to join future inaugural lectures. So there are quite a few, I think. Uh, oh, all right. That's only the next one. There'll be a number of them afterwards. Okay, right. So I hope I've whetted your appetite for what promise to be a fascinating lecture this evening. Williams and Lego, so I pass it over to you.
So I've been asked to put this on in case I stray away from the mic for the benefit of people who are online. So hopefully they can hear me. Right, so traditionally, I looked up what an inaugural was because it would be embarrassing to do the wrong thing. And it's an opportunity for a new professor to profess their research to the community. I've been a professor a couple of years. I thought William had been one for 10. It turns out it's 16. But neither of us had done one. Brunel didn't do them for a while. So when I was invited, I thought it would be nice to share a platform. And we talked about what to do. And we decided to talk a little bit about what the kind of work we do and to try and shed some light on the question, what do English professors do? Which may be obscure to many people. So what we do is to apply insights or to take insights and forms of analysis from literary studies and also philosophy and try and get them to bite on larger real world problems. This actually has a very long tradition since at least the 18th century. If you consult Jürgen Habermas, he will tell you that literary discussion has often been seen as a platform, as a template, as a catalyst for wider discussion of questions, for example, around democracy, questions of public health, and all sorts of other questions. So we're following in a long tradition, I think. So there are two types of research projects, in case you don't know. The first type you make up yourself, and they're quite difficult to get funded for. And the second type is where the government and the research councils will identify a sort of priority, a set of crucial or urgent questions, and sort of put it out to the community to offer what they can offer. And I've been involved in both, but I must say that second type, where you're responding to a set of questions possibly way outside your expertise, can be quite taxing and quite exciting. And that's something that William and I did, for one thing, during the COVID pandemic, and we'll be talking a bit about that. So I've also worked variously, although I'm a literary studies person, I've worked on the challenges of an aging society. I worked a little bit on antimicrobial resistance. As I say, I've worked on COVID, I've worked on secret intelligence, all things which you might think are quite a long way from the modern novel. So the question is, each case, what can cultural analysis bring that has some value and isn't pointless? And the answer we've found time and again is often cultural analysis can bring a lot of value, insights that aren't available or aren't particularly obvious to people in general. The starting question for me with something like, say, COVID is, what is the cultural dimension? Because once you've made something cultural, it's now susceptible to cultural analysis. So any of you who are wanting to get funding in the arts and humanities, I suggest that as a starting point. So we're trying to provide new insights that have some value on larger cultural questions using our insights. As Kwa said, in the last few years, I've been working on writers and intelligence. And this is an area where you'd have thought it's traditionally thought of as not being really to do with culture. And if you look at the traditional scholarship in intelligence studies, you've got the agencies over here. They're defending the realm and fighting off threats and defending national security. And then over here, quite separate, you've got the public and you've got the realm of culture. And it's often spoken about in traditional scholarship as if intelligence, therefore, has nothing to do with the public realm of culture. But of course, agencies themselves, MI5, MI6, etc., are themselves cultural formations. They are formed in response to particular anxieties. They reflect a particular conception at a particular moment of who's a friend and who's an enemy, what is inside our national or block borders and what is outside. They embody particular ways of thinking about what constitutes our security in a given time or place. So I had realized that this was a very rich theme and there was a lot to say. I'm not the only person working in this domain, but the art of research proposals, as many of you will know, is that you have to be pretty concrete. So the frame I decided to put around it, certainly for my first project, is to look at the role of writers in intelligence. So I'm picking a set of people for about a century who have 1 foot in the secret world, 1 foot in the secret state, and 1 foot in the public sphere because they're writers. And I thought these would create an interesting focus for elucidating the relationship between culture and secret intelligence. So I've looked at, for example, how writers have mediated between the secret state and the people. I've looked at the pivotal roles that writers have played in intelligence, which is actually an extraordinary range of roles. But also, one of the most interesting aspects is how writers have ended up providing the shop window for intelligence, because the agencies were secret for many years, and even now, although they're not secret, they can't say much about what they're doing. And by far the dominant public understandings of intelligence come from writers, in particular, let's say 007. And when you think that 007 means the license to commit extrajudicial killings, you can see that actually the way that the public understand intelligence and the priorities of the agencies may not align at all. So this has been of interest to me. And I found that from the very start, certainly of the modern intelligence agencies, I focused mostly on MI5. Fiction and fantasy had played a huge role in secret intelligence. At the time that MI5 was founded, or just before it, there was an enormous spy scare campaign orchestrated by the Daily Mail, which at that time was by far the most successful newspaper in the world. Against a total electorate of around about 5 million, it had 1 million readers. And newspapers of this type, we think, research shows, had more than one reader on average. So they were speaking to a massive proportion of an electorate that wasn't well understood by the powers that be. It was a relatively new electorate. The Daily Mail employed Lord Frederick Roberts, the former commander of the British forces, an immensely popular figure, and William Le Queux, the most popular writer of his day, to feed out on a daily basis a campaign of fake news, firstly about how Britain was infested with thousands and thousands of German spies who weren't collecting intelligence. They were planning to cut down telephone lines, they were planning to blow up railways and direct German troops in as they invaded. And then as the story grew over the days of March and April 1906, we learnt how town after town was falling and how public figures were being put to death. Sometimes they'd write in to complain. And it wasn't true that there was an army of German spies, because we know that from German intelligence records. Actually, Germany had hardly any spies. Almost nobody wanted to spy for Germany because it was a capital crime. And lots of the people, Germans living in Britain, were there because they weren't too happy with the Kaiser's regime, etc. So there were almost no German spies. But nevertheless, a large proportion of the electorate, and increasingly members of the government, began to become convinced by this, with the result that eventually MI5 was formed to combat this fictional army. And laws were changed. For example, the Official Secrets Act was modified. One of its effects of that modification was that the presumption of innocence was removed, a fundamental principle of British democracy. So if someone was suspected of spying, it was now up to them to prove that they weren't. You can read the Official Secrets Act 1911, and you'll be shocked at some of the other provisions. So you've got this scare story whipped up by a right-wing newspaper, compounded with more stories that are fed into government in various ways. And this is the basis on which it was decided to found our domestic security agency. So something that seems not very susceptible to cultural analysis in this case actually turns out to be extremely interesting from that perspective. Now, I just want to shift and say for a couple of minutes a project that William and I worked on, because I'd put together this proposal and then COVID hit. And obviously it was a terrible time. Lots of people were dying on a daily basis. But the government, again, wanted academics to put their heads together and what they could contribute. So we decided to put together a research project, also based on spying. We partnered with an established analytics provider And our idea was that we were going to scrape social media and other online data from tens of thousands of you guys and try to discover why particular groups, demographic segments, and occupational groups, for example, were finding it difficult to keep themselves safe. Because, for example, it was already clear that Bangladeshi men were dying at several times the rate of white men, and care workers were dying at several times the rate of academics, say. So the idea was that we were going to analyze the dominant conversation, see who the influencers were, and create a policy feed into government so that better targeting of messaging could be made to these particular groups in order to keep people safe. We put this all together in double quick time. It's actually pretty exciting working on it. It was a bizarre time stuck at home, but we were on a daily basis working on quite an exciting project. The research councils took it in and sent it to reviewers who are all computer scientists who were absolutely incensed that we were using a commercial analytics provider and not them. So they hated it, and we didn't get funded. But so again, one of the things that came out a little later, for example, was that one of the reasons care workers and old people were dying was because the culture in the care industry was that care workers were gigging between different care homes. That wasn't understood till later. That's the kind of thing that our project obviously would have revealed. And we did feel like we could have saved lives. So on the other hand, there were all sorts of other fears that would have been interesting to understand. How were anti-vaxxer narratives playing out? Were there hostile foreign actors deliberately poisoning social media? We realized that this project could shed a lot of interesting light on these dynamics by looking at the conversations that were going on in different communities. And I still think it's obviously not valid now in a COVID context, but William's been carrying on working on this, and I still think it has a lot of legs, and we may well return to it. Do you want to talk about your work? Because I'm sure I must have done 15 minutes.
Yeah.
You look reluctant.
Okay, so I'm going to just follow up. So some of this work came out of this incredible collaboration that Jago and I had during COVID. And some of the observations that we made and my giving a deeper dive into how some of the committee work, I don't want to say committee early on, it's very, very frightening and boring. But anyway, it will be much more interesting now. So that was part of that. And then I continued this project forward. So I'm going to take you, trigger alert, back to March 2020. Do you remember? And I'm going to read for the next 4 hours from no, I'm not. I'm just going to read a little bit from the work that I did. So this is just a small amount and written work, and then I'll go on and talk. So if you remember, on March 13, 2020, 3 middle-aged white men stepped up to old-fashioned podia in a wood-panelled chamber reminiscent of their august boarding schools and delivered a message somewhat akin to the end of the world. Those 3 horsemen of the apocalypse were Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty, Chief Science Officer Patrick Vallance, flanking a struggling for sombre setting Boris Johnson, who for some reason had ended up our Prime Minister. I still haven't quite got to the bottom of that. Over the next few minutes, the 3 harbingers of doom calmly outlined the government's strategy for tackling the imminent threat of the COVID-19 pandemic by adopting what is called by epidemiologists herd immunity. Remember that term. Now, like doctors surrounding a brave yet fatal case, their tone was measured, clipped by Eton, and softened by the emollient demands of Whitehall machinations. The whole performance with grass and whatnot was boffinish and typical of British understatement. I say, chaps, I am sorry, but you're all going to cop it. Now, I briefly bought the performance and allowed myself to be lulled into a false state of security as I listened to the calm explanation of my impending doom. Following the science felt a bit like following the yellow brick road in the company of Scarecrow Whitty. I've chosen these roles very carefully. Scarecrow Whitty, Tin Man Vallance, and the tousled Leonine Johnson goofing betwixt them. Now, I should have known, of course, it wouldn't be long before the curtain was raised and the wizard's diminution exposed, and so it proved to be. Now, a few days before that, a guy called Dr. David Halpern appeared on breakfast television to explain and prepare the way for herd immunity. An academic like Jago and I doing a really good job of impact. And he said, there's going to be a point, assuming the epidemic flows and grows, as we think it probably will do, where you'll want to cocoon. Do you remember this term, cocooning? You'll want to protect those at risk groups so that they basically don't catch the disease. And by the time they come out of their cocooning, herd immunity's been achieved in the rest of the population. Hooray! Sadly, over the weekend, they ran the numbers on how many people would actually die from this actual false herd immunity, sometimes called natural herd immunity, which actually means not herd immunity at all. That's herd immunity without a vaccine. And they discovered that there's 500,000 people would die in the UK, and they rapidly pulled the policy and sent out a really good spokesperson called Matt Hancock. Don't know if you remember him. These are the many faces of Matt Hancock. To explain how we'd all got it wrong. We have a plan based on the expertise of world-leading scientists. Herd immunity is not a part of it. That is a scientific concept, not a goal or a strategy. I don't know why you got so confused in the first place. Now, what's peculiar about this use of the term herd immunity is actually herd immunity is a goal or strategy of vaccination programs in epidemiology, and that's where we are now. Roughly 80% of a population are immune to a virus, and therefore the virus either disappears or it becomes endemic within the population and much less of a threat. However, to achieve herd immunity, to arrive at the 80%, you need to have vaccination. That was the bit that they forgot about. You need to have vaccination. Cows, herds. Where does this term come from? I asked myself later, licking my wounds after our disastrous application for funding from the ARI. A vet, an American vet called Potter, invented the idea of herd immunity whilst observing abortion disease in cattle. Of course, it's so obvious. And realized that herd immunity is developed by retaining immune cows, the ones that didn't die, and raising their calves, therefore avoiding the introduction to foreign cattle. Basically, you get a herd, you isolate it, you let most of the calves die, but the ones that survive through natural selection are immune. Oh, do I need to use the hand mic? Stand a bit closer. Now, that's interesting enough. What's really interesting is a guy called Dudley, great name. And in 1924, Dudley applied the idea of herd immunity to humans for the first time at the beginning of the development of the vaccination program that we all now know about. Now, Dudley was looking at two self-forming herds, people on HMS Endurance, which at the time was a training ship, and also pupils in the Royal Hospital School in Greenwich. They both had diphtheria outbreaks, and he was observing a similar phenomena in humans as they had seen in cattle, that there was this thing called herd immunity, where the disease would spread around, and after about 80% of the people had diphtheria, it stopped spreading. It stopped spreading. And that became the basis of the observations of the idea of herd immunity. I will now, he says some interesting things, Dudley, he's quite a controversial character. I will now consider the community or the herd. Nations may be divided into urban or rural herds, or we can contrast the shore-going herd with the sailor herd, or herds dwelling in hospital can be compared with those who live in mental hospitals. He's developing an idea of herding that's a little bit problematic, because herding is usually done by species, and these are not species. These are cultural groups. He does, unfortunately, then go on to say how the British are a really good species and are much less susceptible to certain diseases than members of the colony. But we'll move on from there. Dudley got into trouble in 1934, not for those comments, but for this comparison. These are not the actual pictures. He had a picture of the boys in the Greenwich School, and he had a picture of diphtheria, and he said they're the same. They're the same. They're both herds. This is a herd of viruses. This is a herd of boys. People thought this was deeply distasteful, but actually quite an important observation for what we're going to go and have a look at. Sombreros. I wasn't expecting me to go there either. Let's go back to our herd immunity, fake herd immunity, and what happened there. And for years, I couldn't find out quite what had happened. And then this journalist Friedman put together the box by looking at SPIB, which was one of the committees Jago and I wanted to influence, and SAGE, and realised through reading the minutes that what happened is they were falling out over what to do. It was a state of emergency. And the point of contention was still the potential divisiveness of isolating only the most vulnerable, that's the cocooned individual. This is where the concept of herd immunity was raised. It was justification for letting mass gatherings continue. Remember, we were encouraged to go out to sports events and have parties and spread the disease amongst the robust, healthy ones who wouldn't die, whilst isolating the elderly and vulnerable at the same time. The message was herd, don't herd, at the same time. They were struggling with that. Why? Because they wanted to flatten the sombrero. Now, Johnson is an idiot, but he's a very clever idiot. And this is exactly his way of building a message to explain something to you. The sombrero here was the rate of infections. And the worry amongst the SPIB was that infections were going to hit a peak round about winter 2020. Sorry, Janet. She's supposed me back to that. And the NHS wouldn't be able to cope. And so the idea was to control the amount of infection amongst the population so that that sombrero-shaped bell curve would be flattened and the NHS would not be overwhelmed. That's actually what the policy was. This is the result of what's called nudge theory. So the nudge unit are very influential in the policy making and messaging at the time. And Dr. David Halpern, if you remember before, was on that couch. Is the head of the Behavioral Insights Team, or nudge unit as it's called. What is nudge? Nudge comes from a very famous book called Nudge, bestseller, and the guys also won a Nobel Prize for this observation, and it's called benevolent paternalism. It's manipulating you for your own good based on what they know you would do when you're under pressure and don't have time to think about things. That's because part of your brain is very old and slightly instinctive. So it's like a much more complicated fight or flight idea. Instead of just fight or flight, when you're under pressure, when you've been attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, when you have to fill out a tax return, when your kids are bothering you, or when there's a pandemic, you will unthinkingly do certain things. And if I can manipulate that, I can help you for your own benefit. And I'll only use it for good. I will never use it for evil. Now, these are called heuristics by a guy called Kahneman. And what's interesting here is some of the key heuristics are herding, what we'll see is the messenger effect, and contagion. This particularly explains why it was called herd immunity, because they could have called it population immunity, and they could have called it community immunity, which is too many unities. But they went with herd immunity, the most insulting to you by far, but the one that was on their mind. Why was it on their mind? Because one of the heuristics is called herd heuristic. Birds of a feather flock together. So I think this was on the mind of Halpern and others. What are we going to go with? Herd immunity. Am I making this up? No. For your benefit, I read Dr. David Halpern's Inside the Nudge Unit, which is occasionally interesting. And in that, he says this is before COVID. He says, this is called the messenger effect. Seeing a politician on the news suggesting your kid should get vaccinated may have little impact. But seeing the chief medical officer or senior doctor, white coat and stethoscope around their neck, suggesting the same thing is much more likely to be acted on. It's called the messenger effect, and it also has things like the salience effect, which is using bright colors, the law of three, which is using three things, and E for easy. Easy messaging. Quite amazing. This is before COVID. They just copied it. That's why they got the gig, Jago, and you and I didn't. Another heuristic is now going to step us away from this more journalistic approach to something a bit more like the kind of things that I do, and I'm going to finish that, which is the contagion heuristic, sometimes called magical thinking, which is that even though you're told by a scientist that if you touch that, you'll be okay, you saw someone ill touch it, so you don't want to touch it. And that's sometimes called the similarity effect, which is a bit similar to herding. I'm now going to move away from what I've been talking about and move into a different area, which is the importance of the similarity effect. And you'll discover behind the scenes here that I'm building an argument. My argument is about the similarity of things that should not be similar. We call this biopolitics. And this is because we have this idea from about the 18th century, actually the 17th century, that the state is the body politic. And then we tend to think of, well, the head of state is the head, the organs of the state, like the civil service of the organs, and the body is made up of us. And the comparison of similarity effect here is, as it is in the body, so it is in the state. So the area of field that I work on, biopolitics, looks at the similarity, for example, between actual forms of contagion, actual forms of vaccination, actual immunity, and how they can be used as metaphors for control and persuasion and so on. Here is Roberto Esposito, still alive, an Italian philosopher. And this is where I think our field moves into a deeper analysis than sometimes you might find in the approach I've done earlier, because this is a very profound and disturbing definition of what contagion actually could be for you as you live within our culture. Someone or something penetrates the body, individual or collective, and alters it, transforms it, corrupts it. The term that best lends itself to presenting this dynamic of dissolution is contagion. What was healthy, secure, identical to itself is now exposed to a form of contamination that risks its devastation. It's philosophy, but it's also quite a moving description of the effects of having COVID. It's actually quite emotional to me when I read it, when I think about that's what happened to us. Where does this lead us? Well, one of the ways that it leads us is we started to use ideas of contagion, immunity, infection, and so on for political means. And one of the most well-known of these, which Esposito explains to us, is migration, which is still very much a key term in the political discourse today. The multiple dimensions of the migration phenomenon of spanning social, political, and legal realms is familiar to us, he says. But in addition to constituting a threat to the public order, immigration is also commonly presented by the media as a potential biological risk to the host country, according to a mode that pathologizes the foreigner, pathology, illness, foreigner, the roots of which lie in the European imaginary of the last century. We have built a whole imaginary political body that then allows us to get caught up in the idea of what if that body was infected? How would we immunize it? We're back with my lovely comparison. I blame Dudley for this. He didn't know, but Dudley was already doing this in 1924. So it is in diphtheria, so it is in cultural groups, not humans, but groups of small boys in a particular school. And therefore, he was basically arguing that there's a similarity effect here. The way that infection and immunization might work is impacting on the way we view ourselves as cultural collections, or what he called in 1924, different kinds of herds. Why is this relevant? And I'll end here. And it was fun so far, but now we're going to end on an apocalyptic and maybe even deeply upsetting note, because I like to go all the emotions if possible. COVID is a similarity virus. It jumped species. As it was in raccoon foxes, so suddenly it was in humans. It wasn't at the beginning of 2019. By the end of 2019, it was. COVID was able to discover some kind of similarity between its previous hosts and its current hosts, and that was our fault because we went into the environment of the previous hosts and we ate them. And we caught COVID, and we will keep catching COVIDs until we do something about it. Here's Esposito's chilling conclusion. In life, which in all its forms is the object of immunization, if life cannot be preserved except by placing something inside it that subtly contradicts it. Its salvation thus depends on a wound that cannot heal, because the wound is created by life itself. For life to remain as such, it must submit itself to an alien force. Immunity can prolong life, but only by continuously giving it a taste. Yeah. Dun, dun, dun.
How are we doing? So we thought we'd chat for a bit and then open the conversation out a bit. And hearing you speak then, I was put in mind of a debate that we had often when we were talking about COVID back in spring 2020, where it became repeatedly obvious that our natural home is critique. And we were very, very upset with Boris Johnson's government because we were thinking about questions of safety and how messaging could be improved and so on. And obviously, we weren't going to be funded to critique. We needed to be helpful. And it seems like you caved into that after. Where did that journey go for you?
So I think that we learned that we think our job is speaking truth to power, and what we tell power is they're wrong and that we're right. And then they don't want to talk to us anymore, we discovered. So we realized, oh, the problem is that we're not speaking to these individuals. Also, we misconstrued, I think, people in power with the civil service. We began actually, as we had a relationship with people from the civil service, we began to realize that that's quite different. And I don't think we were being useful in our observations. We were just being really, really critical because that's what we were doing. And I think this was a big realization for me while we were collaborating was, oh, we have to stop being so horrible to them all the time. No wonder they don't want to talk to us.
Yeah.
What they actually want us to do is solve a problem. So why is Nudge successful? Because it saved them some money. When people were not filling out their tax returns, Nudge had something called salience, which is you, William. I still get these from the Vice Chancellor. William. William. And then I thought, oh, and that was like, well, when people have their name used on a letter, they return the form more quickly. Only a small number, 5%, £10 million saved. So I think that was another revelation to me. It was like, oh, that they don't want to hear us undermine them. They just want us to help them with problems that are real and legitimate.
Mm. So the sort of history, what happened was we weren't funded for that, but then not that long after that, I heard that my Writers Intelligence project had become funded.
Lucky you.
Yeah. So we slightly drifted. We have been working on other things together, but
this is the first time we've spoken since that.
One of the takeaways for me was I went back to the intelligence project, and I realized from the COVID work how much our conceptions of security, not health security, public health security, but sort of national security, are bound up with ideas about infestation and contagion. In that first instance, when MI5 and MI6 are being established, we've got this fantasy infestation of hostile spies. But then there's this whole series of sort of comparable moments. One that's worth mentioning is the prevent moment after 9/11, where, if you remember, it was a bit like, do you remember the film The Matrix, where nobody's an agent, but anybody could be? It was sort of like any young person, all they needed to do is be in their bedroom for a little too long, and then maybe on their phone, and they could now be a hostile agent. So this idea that we are infected, that we are infested with a kind of hostile body, runs into the national security space as well, I think.
And then our normal approach would be to simply say, this prevent policy is wrong. Stop it. It's naughty. But what we really should be doing is thinking, well, what is it about the cultural presence of contagion that could over-influence certain decisions such that they may make wrong decisions and put national security at risk, rather than us simply saying, oh, we don't like the policy, which was, I think, our normal way of doing it. And so that's the kind of way that we started to think, well, that we need to make our knowledge useful to anybody from any political background for any particular situation. When we had that meeting, we'll talk about that, with the thing, I forgot what they're called, the Open Innovations team. One of the questions was, what if someone from Swansea asks us how critical theory and philosophy can help with traffic cones? Would we have an answer? And the answer to that was, no, we didn't have an answer. But other disciplines did have an answer. They thought about, oh, they will probably ask about traffic cones, and we could influence people in terms of traffic cones. That was a long way from us at that time, I think.
Is it worth explaining that? Because in the COVID project, we partnered with the IPPR, who are a think tank. We needed a route into government, a route with policy connections that we didn't have or didn't have good enough. And after that moment, you started to think quite a bit more about that, didn't you? And you got involved with. Do you want to say who the Open Innovations
so the Open
team
Innovations team, which Brunel has a very close relationship with and are very active with. So they were, their job, they're in the Cabinet Office. That is not as exciting as I first thought when I read, oh, they're in the Cabinet Office. It's actually not a great place to be, not very powerful. They're in the Cabinet Office, and part of their job is to go out and garner expertise and expert research from people like us. These people, when I say people like us, not us, so not arts and humanities. So they wouldn't really speak to any arts and humanities. They mainly spoke to social sciences because, just for various technical reasons, it was easier for them to understand how to deal with social science research. Although many of them have humanities degrees, many of them do. So they were interested in that idea. And I went to a sort of talk here where they tried to explain how we could communicate with the civil service and policymakers. And none of it seemed relevant to the kind of thing we were doing. So I had a conversation with them, and we started to work out a package that would help us to learn how to do that. And we did, was it 2 or 3 events where we spoke to a few hundred civil servants actually logged on in their lunchtime to listen to, how our research might help them with future policy making, but also, more importantly, for us to understand what civil servants want, because that was very, very opaque and actually quite difficult to find out. And that was the beginning of this process, which eventually was a unit we called Culture and Policy and Culture, where we were trying to sort of make our research more readily available to policymakers. This has proven, I'd like to say, and it was immensely successful. So I'd like to say that.
It was. We did one seminar on difference and racism. And we got a couple of outside experts who we knew, and we had a chat about thinking about it in different ways. And they obviously found it really useful. They'd never had that kind of discussion before. So I think there's mileage there.
There's
It's
mileage,
a work in progress.
but it's very, very difficult. And one of the difficulties that we have is what is evidence from so they want a graph, even though they hate graphs, because they're always looking at graphs. They wanted something that was more like a sombrero than the actual graph. And we were like, well, we are certainly more interesting in some ways, and they liked that, but it remains quite difficult for us to convey the sort of the nuanced approach as just like a 2-page policy document. So we've struggled with that. And I don't think we've cracked it yet. It's quite a difficult thing to do.
Yeah. So the overall project is really to take. We both see, and a lot of our colleagues see, immense potential from the kinds of analysis you can do in arts and humanities for applying to real world problems, if you like. And it's a case of getting the right tie-ups into, for example, policy or into business. And we're still working on it. Shall we open to questions?
Let me show them to questions.
Would anyone like to intervene, make a long monologue on their own work?
It's on mute.
Otherwise, we'll just keep chatting about ourselves.
Yeah, I have a question for you, Jago. You talk about the history of MI5, either MI7 now.
I've only really, I don't think MI7 exists, or if it does, I don't know about it.
Well, the reason I'm asking is we have the equivalent of social media. And there's a lot of fake news. I presume something has been created in the government to dispel this.
Maybe,
news.
I don't know. I mean, I've ended up, because just because of the way the work went and the way the sort of themes I ended up exploring, I've mostly explored MI5. And it's been a really interesting journey in that it's got this bizarre early history. And if you look at Vernon Kell, he was the first Director General of MI5. If you look at his diaries, he's clearly completely bought into the fantasy of this army of spies and so on. And then it goes through various interesting iterations right up until the last writer I studied was Stella Rimington, who was Director General of MI5 and then became a novelist. And in her tenure, she was the first Director General to be publicly acknowledged, and she was absolutely caned in a misogynistic way, actually, by the press at the time. Had quite a difficult time, But she made it her project to resell and reform MI5 as a democratically accountable institution, because the Cold War was over and we were no longer trying to smoke out Soviet moles. Instead, we were doing counterterrorism and so forth. And so really, MI5 needed to be much more mindful of legality. They were going to be prosecuting, suspects and so forth. And then when she starts writing, it's post 9/11. And she's still arguing in the books and trying to model in the books for this kind of democratically accountable mode of doing intelligence. But of course, we're now in the war on terror, and we've got extraordinary rendition and the doctrines of the Bush White House. So she ends up in an interesting oppositional relationship at a time, a very dark time in national security. So so MI5 and the role of writers in it has turned out to be really interesting, and I haven't had any time for MI6, and I don't even know about MI7.
Thank you very much for that presentation. It was quite enlightening for me, especially as someone who comes from a political background. It was a bit of a one an observation. Secondly, a bit of a joke. Has the Daily Mail taken on board with the contagions from the migrants? That's something that they've kind of picked up on, because
well, make sure people can hear that I don't read the Daily Mail on a daily basis. Contagion as a term is regularly used. Yes, it's regularly used in the popular press. It's regularly used in the language. It's not exactly an example of contagion, but do you remember that David Cameron talked about immigrants as a swarm? So swarming and contagion are related, because if you were herd, it's associated with the spread of disease. And that is indeed why we have so many diseases. It was when we stopped roaming the steppes of Slough free with our reindeer, but settled down and herded our reindeer and lived together, that we caught a bunch of viruses. And so the idea, and Cameron called immigrants a swarm, and he got into a lot of trouble, if you remember about that. And it is regularly used in American discourse in a wide variety of different things. It isn't a niche thing at all. So it is a common way of talking about migrants, as is the other metaphor related to that, which is the kind of animalization, which again is related to herding and cocooning, because they're all animalization terms. So yes, we study that quite a lot. And so the idea of migrants coming over and infecting or overwhelming the system, even those, I think, are contagion metaphors. When people say, oh, there's too many and I can't get an appointment to the doctor, it sort of is part of this contagion feeling that it's taking over. As is radicalization's another good one, actually. Radicalization was really presented as if you just had to read one tweet and you would catch radicalization, and then you would go and become a member of ISIS. There was a kind of feeling.
Can I just say that the campaign that I'm talking about, which is 1906 to 1909, fake news campaign, it was called the Invasion of 1910 because Germany was going to invade in 1910. The first day that this came out, and it was a massive, massive event. By the way, they advertised in the local press. They'd advertise which towns were going to be attacked the next day and who was going to be killed. And people dressed as German soldiers paraded up and down Oxford Street and so forth, advertising atrocity.
Just want to say, this is an amazing story. I mean, I'm really.
Can I just say that on the day of the first episode, we'll call it, I think possibly on the same page or on the facing page, they also carried an article called Mixed Marriages, which was calling for marriages between Indian men or Asian men and white women to be annulled because of the threat of. So there was racism in there right from the start. But as far as the infestation goes, it's rather different actually, because the feared enemy is Imperial Germany, who's arming to the teeth, and so they're always an army. It's not a sort of they're not vermin. The Germans are never vermin. In some ways, they're far more disciplined than the British are, and they're actually in some ways admirable for that. And we should be emulating them. In this campaign, they call for Frederick Roberts, the former chief of the British Army, calls for soldiership, in other words, military training, to be the condition of having the vote. and they call for a total overhaul of the school curriculum to inculcate military discipline, because it's this army. It's a rather different, it's not the same as, it takes a different form, even though there's kind of similarities there.
You promised us a joke. What did I miss here?
But it was kind of, the Daily Mail is a joke. So,
Oh.
it was very similar to what you say about the weapons of mass destruction. 45 minutes, we will be able to be hit by Iraq, and that was another contagion that came through. So it's very similar to what you're referring to. I'll let other people ask questions, but I just wanted to ask one question. Do you think what you're describing to us, is kind of weaponizing the far right? Because this is the rhetoric that they use all the time. We saw the contagion, etc., of what happened recently, of the riots about 3 months ago.
Mhm.
Is this all that narrative? Is this what's playing out with all your research, what we're seeing today?
Well, the most important metaphor that I didn't use is going viral. But when Esposito wrote that book, he was funny. He was talking about the threats. It was written in the year 2000. He was talking about the threats of computers in taking over, and it was to do with the millennium bug. And he was saying the virus will take over. And I was teaching this last week, wasn't it? And nobody knew what this virus. They were all born way after. I was like, what is he? He's afraid of what? That the number 0 would flip in comparison to our fear of going viral, which is, of course, similar to what you're talking about here. So viral is, a really important metaphor for our concerns about social media. But also it's ambiguous, because you want to go viral. So it's not just that we're afraid of it. I would love my videos, which I'm getting a lot of. I've had 2 or 3 likes so far. I'd love to get to 5, and go viral. So that is a really interesting metaphor that maintain. You can see that when that has legs, Jago and I start to ask, what's the cultural reasons for that, and how does it mutate? Whereas a social scientist might just do a questionnaire and ask about these. We're interested, I suppose, in like a kind of cultural history. Where's it come from? Why viral? Is that a coincidence?
Yeah, my immediate thought when you're talking about the far right and the attacks in Southport and so on is, I need to study that before I give you an answer. I will just say, though, that we've been addicted to infections and pandemics for years and years. I don't know if you remember that prior to the HIV and AIDS, which was a serious pandemic, we were all going to die of herpes for a while. Do you remember that? If you're a certain age, and there was Ebola, bird flu. We have these real pandemics, but in among them, we like to have a few fake ones as well. But yeah,
maybe I should just say. So in one of the courses that I teach, we look at zombies because students like zombies. Well, actually, zombie is like our 21st century monster. We used to have vampires, and looking at monsters is a thing that we do in literary studies quite a lot. And the zombie is usually against a background of Contagion. In fact, one of the slides that I used there was from the film Contagion. And so that's really good proof for us that this narrative or these metaphors are really, really important for unlocking what's going on in culture. And what Jago and I would have liked to have done is like, what is people saying online about zombies and Contagion and so on? But it's definitely a very important cultural phenomenon. I can imagine that would never be discussed in a government committee. And that would be a weird thing to have in the middle of a crisis meeting. Me saying, have you seen Walking Dead? But that's the kind of incongruity that we were looking for in our project. What would happen if we were on that committee?
I mentioned the antimicrobial resistance thing that I worked on, which was akin to COVID in the way, and it was about public health. And in both cases, it was about public understandings of disease, because with the antimicrobial resistance piece, the thing I was focusing on was the fact that a lot of GPs were coming under pressure, and they were failing under the pressure or caving into the pressure to prescribe antibiotics for people who didn't need them, because people were insisting on them. And what I wanted to look into was, well, where are people's false ideas of disease coming from? Are they coming from film and TV? And you can't really you can't really provide effective public health guidance, particularly for particular groups, without understanding where their ideas come from. So there is a role for, even if you look at Mission Impossible, say, there'll be some killer virus, but there'll also be an antidote. these are false ideas, and you need to understand how people are thinking, how different groups are thinking, in order to sort of educate. So there is a role for cultural analysis, and it will unlock it.
This row is very good for questioning. No pressure on other rows, but this is the key row at the moment.
I think the use of the word contagion is quite useful in the socio-political world. I can remember I went to Romania after Ceausescu's regime fell, and we were going out to give aid to the orphans. And I could see that he'd used a contagion of paranoia, because there were families that were fearing one another for fearing they were giving information to the Securitat. He didn't even need to get machine guns or anything. He'd used this, he'd infected them with this paranoia. So that's one thing I wanted to put forward, to say that I quite like this idea of the contagion. But on the subject of secrets, we're now in Twitter sphere and Instagram and things where there ain't any secrets anymore. But in the Second World War, in conflict zones, it was well known the loose lips sink ships. There were things that you had to keep quiet. And it was quite fascinating when Russia invaded Ukraine. We were seeing on the media even plans being put forward in Twitter. We're letting the enemy know where people are and things. And the media, the reporters, in this keenness to get an article out there, to get some money in, they were going into areas where civilians were in hiding from the bombing. And you think, this is so crazy, because now we've got like bunker busting bombs, and they may be going underground to be safe, but they're not safe. And now you're giving their location away, because it's easy to track people's location now. So where are we with secrets? Because there seems to be a lot of spillage. Bringing in the social media, there are contagions called trolls, aren't there? that are out there to try and influence things and twist things and turn things. So that's another one to look at.
That's another lecture.
With the Second World War piece, I don't have time to go into it, but one of the things I worked on in the Writers' Intelligence Project is writers who worked in deception. And that's another piece that has to be put there, that, it seems like we're spilling information loosely, but are we? And who's spilling the information, and, what rival agendas are there? So I think I'm sure there's probably slightly better control of the information space than might appear.
I won't say any more about it, but so I look at privacy and secrecy. There was a huge amount in. I was doing a lecture. Jane Austen invented Facebook. So basically, I was saying, Jane Austen invented. She's a novelist. She invented a narrative technique, which was called free and direct discourse. So basically, she would listen in to the thoughts of the characters and report them in the third person, but as if she could hear the minds of those people. Then she published their private thoughts. Oh, Mr. Darcy, I was wonderful hair. I wonder if you noticed me. And then she would publish that and make money. And that's just basically what Facebook does. It just takes your private discussions as regards your pets, it publishes them, and it makes money from it. And then I do a sort of analysis of this idea of secrecy. And I look at the cultural construction of secrecy, which has changed quite a lot over a period of 200 years. And then that's, again, a good example of how our field might do something like that. And there are similar studies with the idea of secrecy as well, and the idea of the sort of hidden self. So this is and literature is about publishing secrets, because it's your private stuff, and then you ask people to read it, which, is problematic. But at least novelists don't complain. You read my novel, but everybody complains that you read my tweets about my beautiful cat and then threatened to kill my family because you're dog people.
So I think we're overrunning.
We're done. No, we've got one more question. Oh, no.
That's okay. Go on. Go for it, Bill. Bill was one of the GPs being pressured into prescribing antibiotics.
I didn't know Diplococcus was a virus, but it seems to me that anybody who can give an angle on how to control fake news or how to anticipate the responses of the public to fake news or to use fake news for your own advantage would be right at the cutting edge of what a lot of people with money or politicians might want to know about. And my other observation was I hadn't realized there'd been such a lot of fake news in the past, in the First World War. But has there been any research done as to whether, I think it was what one of the other speakers' questions was saying, about whether there's much more susceptibility to fake news now with the internet, and that we're much more easily exposed to sort of thought insertion or exposure.
Well, this
to
is the kind
thoughts.
of thing that a project like our COVID project would hope to discover. One of the things is, the reasons we didn't do it is because it costs a lot of money. It costs a great deal of money to have. You need a lot of computing power, and you're going through hundreds of thousands of online conversations, and you're sorting millions of users out into cohorts that you have to find ways to put them into cohorts so that you can understand where they're coming from demographically and so on. And it's a complex and expensive business. Would we like to investigate this? Yes, we would. Need some money though.
That sort of reflects back on secrecy. Some secrets are known by people who can afford to get access to that information, scrape the data, parse the data, put it together into cohorts. But for Jago and I mean, Jago is a billionaire, but he's quite mean with his money. He doesn't want to spend his money. But like for us, the cost of just getting the data before we even did the process was prohibitive and very difficult. So in fact, that data is kind of restricted because access to it and understanding that will be great. It's actually, everyone thinks, so the data's out there, just use it. It is, but you can't get it in a form that you can analyze
because there's billions and billions of data points, if you like.
Because there's so much of it. That actually bizarrely makes it more secretive
Yeah.
than if there was just a bit. We can study 5 novels, but we can't study a billion tweets.
Yeah.
And then we fail to solve that problem.
But if we do find a way to do it, I do think a lot of the tools of cultural analysis will be very interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, should we?
Okay. I'm sure this conversation will continue. Thank them again. So there's drinks outside, so I would like to invite you to join the reception afterwards. So it has been a fascinating talk, and there's a lot of topics we can follow on. Fake news, it's been around since the history started.